He only wanted to help, but what she brought back would rewrite the story of his entire life. Rain hammered the cracked pavement as James hoisted another sodden plank onto his shoulder, his fingers raw from splinters and overuse. He didn't know her name, only that her car had stalled in front of the diner last week, and that her mother, frail and silent in the passenger seat, had been trapped without a way to get inside. She hadn't asked for help. Most people didn't. But when James saw the older woman struggle with dignity and the daughter trying to hide her embarrassment, something in him, a buried instinct honed by years of quiet heartbreak, told him to act. He came back the next morning, uninvited, tools in hand. And now, 3 days later, the ramp was almost finished. No thanks, no small talk. Just the echo of his own hammer and the briefest glimpse of her profile through the blinds. When the knock came on the third morning, he expected awkward gratitude or a polite dismissal. Instead, she stood there soaking wet, eyes wide, clutching a folded piece of paper to her chest. "I didn't know how to say this," she whispered, "but you need to read this now. It's about your son." James Keller woke at 5:12 a.m., like he did every morning, not because an alarm told him to, but because years of habit had etched the rhythm into his bones. His body ached before his feet hit the floor. The worn springs of the couch, turned bed, groaned as he sat up, rubbing his eyes with the heels of his hands. The tiny two-bedroom apartment was still and cold, the heat already pushing its limit for the month. His son, Eli, lay curled under a faded Avengers blanket on the mattress in the next room, one sock missing, a stuffed bear tucked beneath his chin. James didn't wake him. Instead, he moved quietly through the cramped kitchen, stepping over a Lego minefield with the precision of a veteran, grabbing the thermos he'd filled the night before and pouring what was left of the milk into a cereal bowl for Eli's breakfast. The clock on the microwave blinked the wrong time again. He didn't bother fixing it. Some things stayed broken. He pulled on his Navy mechanic's jacket, the one with his name stitched in cursive above the pocket, though the thread had started to come undone. It used to belong to his father, and now it belonged to the hours James sold every week just to keep the lights on. Work started at 7, and if he hustled, he could drop Eli at school, hit the shop floor by the bell, and maybe squeeze in half a sandwich by noon if no one needed an emergency tire rotation or a brake job they swore they couldn't afford last week. That morning, though, was different. The sky was low and gray as they left the apartment, a stubborn drizzle misting their jackets. Eli clung to his father's hand, hopping over puddles and launching into quiet commentary about the color of earthworms. James nodded and smiled, only half listening, his mind already at the garage, the overdue rent, and the grocery list he'd have to revise again. They passed the old corner diner on 5, and that's when James saw her. A rusted sedan sat lopsided against the curb, steam curling from under the hood. A woman stood beside it, drenched in the rain, her fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly the knuckles gleamed white. She wasn't yelling, she wasn't flagging anyone down. She just stood there, staring straight ahead with a look that James recognized too well. Next to her, in the passenger seat, sat an older woman. Her mother, it seemed thin and still, her eyes blinking slowly as she stared at the slick sidewalk ahead. James slowed. Most people passed by without stopping. They looked, maybe, then kept walking, pretending not to see. He had done that before, too. You couldn't save everyone. But there was something about the way the daughter clenched her jaw and adjusted the shawl around the older woman's shoulders, the way she scanned the entrance of the diner like she was calculating the slope of the curb. There were 3 steps up to the door, no ramp, no access, nothing but concrete and rain and a silent wall of indifference. He hesitated, then glanced at Eli, who had also stopped. The boy's brow furrowed. "She looks stuck," he said. James nodded. "She does." He turned and approached them slowly, hands raised slightly so he wouldn't startle anyone. "You need help?" he asked, voice low. The woman turned to look at him, her dark hair plastered to her cheeks. She seemed unsure whether to accept or refuse. Then she nodded, once. "It just overheated," she said. "I think. My mom hasn't eaten yet, and this was the only place close by." James glanced at the steps again. "She use a wheelchair full-time?" "Yes. We just moved. The ramp at our old place. It was different." She looked down, embarrassed. James crouched slightly, as if examining the car, though his eyes flicked to the diner's entrance. "She'll never get up those stairs," he muttered. "I know," the woman replied, voice cracking. "I didn't expect. I thought there'd be one." She turned away before he could say more, pulling out her phone, likely searching for alternate options, ride services, shelters, anything that might take them. Her fingers shook. James didn't push. He offered a business card with his name and the shop number, said he'd come by later to check the car if she wanted. She nodded again, distracted. Eli waved shyly at the older woman, who smiled just faintly. At the school drop-off line, James barely registered the teacher's greetings. His mind circled back to the broken car and the woman who didn't ask for help even though she clearly needed it. Something about the silence of it stuck in his chest. He thought of the months his own wife had wasted away in the hospital, refusing pity, the way she used to grip the arms of her wheelchair like she could will herself to stand again. He had hated those ramps then. Now, he saw their absence like a wound. After work, instead of going home, James drove past the diner again. The car was gone, but the image remained. He took a slow breath, turned into the alley beside the building, and parked. The steps were still there, unchanged. No one else had noticed. No one else would. That night, while Eli slept, James pulled a tarp off his old toolbox and started measuring out wood in the kitchen. He didn't know her name. He didn't know if she'd even come back. But something told him she would, and when she did, he wanted that ramp to be ready. James showed up the next morning, just after sunrise, before the diner opened and before the sidewalk filled with people too busy to notice who could or couldn't climb stairs. He pulled his truck up to the curb and stepped out with a quiet resolve, hands stuffed in the pockets of his coat, eyes scanning the entrance once more. The steps hadn't changed overnight. Still 3 of them. Still steep. Still a barrier that shouldn't exist. He opened the tailgate and unloaded the planks he'd sanded the night before, checking the edges with practiced fingers. Years of fixing brakes and replacing radiators had given him the kind of attention to detail that didn't rely on blueprints. He knelt on the sidewalk and began measuring the incline by feel and instinct. A few passers-by slowed down to watch, some curious, some confused. No one asked what he was doing. By the time the diner's neon sign flickered to life in the window, he'd already framed half the ramp. His breath hung in front of him in clouds as he drilled the boards into place, each turn of the screw echoing against the brick walls of the narrow street. The owner came out once, asked what was going on. James explained, barely looking up. The man shrugged and said, fine, as long as it didn't get in the way of deliveries. On the second day, she returned. Her mother sat beside her again, bundled in a thick shawl, eyes quiet and watchful. The daughter parked farther down this time and walked the distance. She stopped short when she saw him. "You came back," she said, voice guarded but softer than before. James stood and wiped his hands on a rag, figured it was worth finishing. She took a breath, nodded slowly. No one's ever done something like this, not without asking for something. He didn't respond to that right away. He just looked at her, then at the ramp, then back at her mother still sitting patiently in the car. "She deserves to eat at the diner just like anybody else," he said finally. Her name was Sophia. She told him this after a moment's silence, when her mother waved her over and she stepped closer to speak more quietly. Her mother's name was Marisol. They had moved in with relatives temporarily after Marisol's condition worsened and the home they'd lived in became too expensive to maintain. Sophia worked from home now, part-time, and spent the rest of her hours caregiving. They hadn't planned to stay in the neighborhood, but they were here for now, and sometimes that was all a person could count on. As James returned to his work, Sophia lingered nearby, occasionally asking questions about how he knew what kind of incline was safe, how he managed to make the supports so steady with so few materials. He explained without pretense, walking her through the basic math and adjustments. She didn't talk much, but she listened in a way that told him she had lived through the kind of days that teach a person to stay quiet and observant. At one point, she offered to help hold a beam while he fastened it. Their hands brushed, but neither pulled away. The moment passed without words, but it left something behind, a thread between them that hadn't been there before. By the time the second day faded into dusk, the frame was solid, and the walkway stretched from the bottom step to the sidewalk, like it had always belonged there. Sophia stood beside him in the orange wash of the street lamp and said thank you again. This time, her voice didn't crack, her eyes didn't look away. James nodded and began packing up his tools. He didn't ask if she would be back tomorrow. He just knew he'd be there, hammer in hand, to finish what he started. That night, after James tucked Eli into bed and folded the last of the laundry, he sat on the floor of the living room with a mug of tea that had gone cold too fast. The toolbox lay open beside him, screws and washers scattered like loose thoughts across the rug. The apartment was quiet except for the soft tick of the wall clock and the occasional creak of the building settling into its old bones. He leaned back against the couch and let his mind wander to places he rarely allowed himself to visit. He remembered the hospital room, pale light filtering through plastic blinds, the scent of antiseptic and old flowers clinging to the air. He'd pushed Leah's wheelchair through those halls more times than he could count, her fingers cold in his hand even on summer days. Her strength had always humbled him. She fought hard, not for herself, but for Eli. Back then, he didn't know how she held it all together. Now he understood. When you had a child looking up at you with eyes that still believed in everything good, you learned to fake strength until it became something real. After she passed, there was no ceremony that could patch over the silence she left behind. No graveside prayers could tell Eli why she wasn't coming back. James had sat up for hours those first nights, listening to his son cry quietly into his pillow, pretending not to hear because he didn't know how to fix that kind of broken. Eventually, the crying stopped. But James never stopped listening. He reached down now and ran a finger along the smooth edge of a wooden beam he'd pre-cut for the ramp. It felt like the kind of thing Leah would have smiled at, not because it was grand or impressive, but because it was decent. She had always believed in small acts of goodness, holding a door, buying a stranger's coffee, building a ramp for a woman you didn't know because her mother deserved to feel like the world still had space for her. James sometimes wondered what Eli remembered of her. His son still carried around that threadbare stuffed bear Leah had bought at a gas station on the way home from one of her early treatments. Eli claimed the bear had healing powers. James never corrected him. He took a deep breath, staring at the tools around him. There were bills in a drawer he hadn't opened in days, and a voicemail from his landlord he hadn't returned. The shop had cut hours again. He might not make rent this month. And yet, here he was, spending time and money on wood and nails for someone else. Maybe it was foolish. Maybe it was exactly what kept him human. James stood and began to gather his tools. Tomorrow he would finish the ramp. It wasn't about charity. It wasn't about being noticed. It was about keeping a promise he hadn't spoken out loud. To Leah. To Eli. To himself. The third morning came colder than the last, wind curling around the corners of the diner like it was looking for something to steal. James arrived just after dawn with a thermos of coffee and a stiff shoulder from sleeping wrong. The ramp was nearly finished now, just a few bolts and rails left to secure. He worked steadily, rhythmically, as if the movement alone could keep the world from shifting beneath him. The sun was still low when he heard the footsteps. Not the heavy clatter of a delivery driver or the shuffle of an early customer, but something quieter, lighter. He turned and saw her. Sophia stood at the edge of the sidewalk, hair damp from the mist, hands clutching something close to her chest. Her coat hung open, and her breath came in quick bursts, not from exertion but from something else. Fear, hesitation, resolve. James wiped his hands on a rag and stepped away from the ramp. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she held out a folded sheet of paper, the edges worn like it had been handled too many times. Her eyes didn't meet his. "I found this last night," she said, voice thin. "It was in one of my mom's old boxes. I think it's meant for you." He took the paper without a word and unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was neat, careful, but faded in spots where time had softened the ink. At the top, it was dated nearly 7 years earlier. It was addressed not to him by name, but simply, "To the man who will raise the boy I couldn't." James read the first few lines and felt something tighten behind his ribs. Sophia stood silent as he continued, her hands fidgeting in the sleeves of her coat. The letter was from Marisol. It spoke of a decision made under impossible circumstances. A woman alone, facing illness, caring for 2 young children after her husband had left. When things became too much, she had made the choice to entrust her youngest son to a friend, Leah. The friend had promised to love the child like her own and raise him away from the chaos that had begun to surround them. There had been no formal adoption, no paperwork, just a promise between 2 women who had known each other since college. James reached the part of the letter where Marisol explained why she hadn't reached out sooner. Regret weighed heavy in every line. She had thought of contacting Leah again, especially after her health improved, but then she heard Leah had passed. After that, she didn't know how to find the boy. She feared too much time had passed. She feared being a stranger to her own son. James looked up from the page, the words blurring slightly. His voice came out hoarse. "Eli?" Sophia nodded. "My brother. I only learned the truth a week ago. My mom never talked about it. Not really. I was too young to understand what happened. But she wrote that letter, kept it with her things. I think she meant to give it to you someday, but she never found the right moment." James couldn't speak. The weight of it all settled on his chest like something both beautiful and crushing. He thought of Eli's quiet resilience, the way he clung to James's side during thunderstorms and told stories to his stuffed bear before bed. He had never questioned where Eli came from. Leah had said he was family, and that had been enough. Sophia stepped closer. "I know this is a lot. I didn't come here to take him. I just thought you had a right to know, and maybe he does too." James folded the letter carefully and held it to his chest. He looked at the ramp, still waiting for its final bolt, then back at Sophia. The woman he'd helped without a second thought had just handed him a piece of his life he never knew was missing. "I think," he said slowly, "we're both standing at the beginning of something." Sophia followed James back to his truck, the letter still folded in his hand, the words echoing louder now that silence had taken hold. He opened the passenger door for her without asking and climbed into the driver's seat, not quite ready to go home, but not knowing where else to sit with something this big. She looked out the windshield as if expecting the street to explain what came next. "I don't know what to do with this," James said finally, voice low. "I keep thinking I should be angry, but I'm not." Sophia turned to him. "I was angry when I found out. At first, not at you, not even at her, really. Just at all the time we lost. At how quiet people can be about the things that matter most." James nodded, his fingers tapping the steering wheel. "Leah never told me where Eli came from. Not the full story. Just said she needed help, and that we had a chance to give him something better. I didn't ask for details. I figured if she was carrying it that close to the chest, it wasn't my business." "She didn't tell you he wasn't hers?" He shook his head. "She said he was ours. That was all I needed." Sophia looked down at her hands. "My mom used to say she didn't believe in perfect families, just good enough ones, but she never said what happened to Eli. She told people he went to live with a distant cousin. I thought maybe he'd been adopted, but there were no records, nothing, just her shutting the door when his name came up. James leaned back, staring at the roof of the cab. The truth hadn't undone anything, but it had redrawn the shape of what he thought he knew. He imagined Leah, sick and stubborn, protecting Eli with everything she had, even if it meant leaving behind the truth. He had always respected her strength, but now he saw the burden she carried, raising a child who wasn't hers, shielding him from the wreckage of someone else's collapse. "I look at him," he said, "and I still see my boy. Nothing about that's going to change. But now I wonder what parts of him came from someone else, from you, from her." Sophia smiled faintly. "He looks like my dad did when he was little. Same eyebrows, same way of tilting his head when he's thinking. I saw it in the picture on your fridge." James blinked. "You've been in my apartment?" "Last night. You weren't home. I knocked. Your neighbor said it was okay to leave something at your door. I put the letter in an envelope. Then I saw the photo, him and the bear. That was when I knew for sure." He laughed under his breath, the sound not quite amused. "That bear goes everywhere with him. He says it has healing powers." Sophia nodded. "It used to be mine. My mom kept it after I stopped sleeping with it. I guess it made its way to him." They sat quietly for a moment, the world moving outside the windows, cars passing, people walking past the diner without a glance at the ramp James had nearly finished. Then he turned to her. "What do you want, Sophia?" Her eyes met his. "I want to know him. I don't need to be his sister if that's too much right now. I want to be someone in his life. Someone who understands where he came from. Someone who doesn't let him carry it alone." James looked out at the ramp. It had started as a gesture, a quiet way to say the world could be kinder. Now it felt like a bridge in more ways than one. He thought of Eli's face when he smiled. How much of that joy had been earned with years of patient love, bedtime stories, early mornings, and scraped knees. None of that changed because a letter showed up. "You should come by tomorrow," he said. "We'll talk to him, together." Sophia's shoulders eased. "Are you sure?" "I'm not sure about anything," James said, "except that Eli deserves the truth. And he deserves a sister who brings back lost pieces of his life." She nodded, eyes wet but steady. In that moment, they weren't strangers anymore. They were something else. Not quite family, not yet, but close enough to begin. James barely slept that night. After Sophia left, he sat on the couch long after Eli had gone to bed, the letter resting on the coffee table like a weight that hadn't settled yet. He read it again, slower this time, letting the shape of each sentence press into him. Marisol's words weren't poetic, but they were honest. She had loved her son, and she had been afraid. Afraid of failing him, afraid of not surviving long enough to raise him, afraid of what would happen if the truth ever caught up with the choice she made. James understood that fear more now than he ever had before. He looked toward the hallway where Eli slept, the faint sound of soft breathing, a fragile comfort in the stillness. Everything about Eli had always made sense to him. His curiosity, his way of asking questions that didn't always need answers, his tendency to pull close when he was tired. James had held him through fevers, helped him through nightmares, taught him to ride a bike on the cracked pavement outside their building. He had loved him without condition, because that was what Leah had asked of him, and because somewhere along the way it had stopped being a favor and become something sacred. Now he kept asking himself the same question. If Eli wasn't truly his son by blood, did it change who he was to him? Every time the question surfaced, it sank just as fast. He didn't love Eli because he had to. He loved him because Eli had become his reason for standing back up every time life knocked him down. He loved him because when Leah died, and the world turned cruel and cold, Eli had crawled into his lap and whispered that they were still a team. That word had saved him. Still, the truth came with weight. If Eli asked about his mother now, about where he came from, what would James say? Could he explain that the woman who raised him wasn't his birth mother? Could he admit he hadn't asked more questions when he should have? That he had been content not to know? When the sun finally broke through the blinds, James rose to make breakfast, his movements slower than usual. He cracked eggs into the pan and let the smell fill the room, familiar and grounding. Eli patted in wearing mismatched socks and rubbing his eyes, the bear still tucked under one arm. He climbed into his chair and waited, wordless, watching his father like he always did when something felt different. James placed a plate in front of him and sat down across the table. "Hey, buddy," he said gently. "Can I tell you something important?" Eli blinked and nodded. "There's someone I want you to meet today. Her name is Sophia. She's really kind, and she knows some things about your past, about where you came from, things I didn't know until recently." Eli frowned a little. "Like what?" James hesitated. "Like the fact that you had a different mom before Leah, a mom who loved you very much but couldn't take care of you the way she wanted to, so she asked someone she trusted to raise you. And that's how you came to us." The boy was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked down at his bear. "Do I still get to be your son?" James felt something break and rebuild in the same breath. He reached across the table, taking Eli's small hand in his own. "You've always been my son. Nothing will ever change that." Eli nodded slowly. "Okay. Can Sophia have pancakes too?" James smiled, tears stinging his eyes. "Yeah, she'd like that." Sophia arrived just after 9, a little unsure, carrying a small bag of pastries and a nervous smile. James met her at the door, nodded, and stepped aside to let her in. Eli stood in the hallway, one sock sliding off his heel, holding his bear tight under his arm. He studied her like he was trying to match her face to a memory he didn't have. James knelt beside him. "This is Sophia," he said gently. "She's your sister, your real sister." Eli tilted his head. "Like, really?" Sophia crouched, so they were eye level. "I know it sounds strange, but yeah, I'm your big sister. We used to live together a long time ago, when you were still really little." Eli considered that. "You look nice," he said finally. Sophia smiled, the tension in her shoulders softening. "So do you." They sat down together at the small kitchen table, the three of them sharing warm pancakes and awkward silences that slowly turned into laughter. Sophia told a story about how their mom used to make the worst macaroni, and Eli laughed so hard he spilled syrup on his shirt. James watched it all with a quiet heart, letting the new rhythm unfold without forcing it. Later, they walked to the diner. The air was crisp, the sky clear for once. The ramp was finished now, smooth and sturdy, wood-sealed and shining in the sun. James stood back as Sophia wheeled Marisol up the slope, her mother wrapped in a warm shawl, eyes bright with something between pride and apology. Marisol reached out and took James's hand. Her grip was weak, but the emotion behind it wasn't. No one spoke much, but they didn't need to. Sometimes presence meant more than any words. Inside the diner, Eli sat between Sophia and James, kicking his legs beneath the booth, humming quietly as he colored the kids' menu. The family looked different now. It wasn't what James ever expected. It wasn't what Sophia had imagined either. But it was real, and it was theirs. Kindness had built the ramp. Truth had built the bridge. And love, steady and unspoken, had made all of it possible. A month later, the ramp had weathered its first storm and held strong. The diner owner had painted it a soft gray to match the building, and now other regulars used it without a second thought. No one remembered the days before it had been there, and that was exactly how James liked it. He stood across the street, sipping coffee from a to-go cup, watching as Sophia pushed Marisol up the incline with ease. They had settled into a rhythm now. Most mornings they met at the diner before work or appointments. Eli joined on weekends, always rushing ahead to hold the door. That morning Eli ran out in front, waving at James with one hand and clutching his bear in the other. Sophia followed a step behind, her laughter cutting through the chilly air. Marisol gave a small wave from her seat, wrapped in her favorite shawl. James crossed the street slowly, letting the moment stretch. It was simple and quiet, nothing dramatic or grand, but it was whole. When he reached the door, Eli grabbed his hand. "I saved you a seat," he said. James smiled, nodded. "Then I guess I'd better take it." Inside, the booth by the window was already warm from shared stories and spilled syrup. The sun streamed through the glass, casting long golden lines across the table. James slid into the booth beside Eli, who leaned against him without a word. Across from them, Sophia looked up and met his eyes. She didn't speak either. She didn't have to. What had started with a splintered piece of wood and a quiet decision had become something permanent, something binding. Family, James thought, was not always born. Sometimes it was built, one choice at a time.